So we're just gonna go right into it. So as I was preparing for this lecture, I remembered a question I was asked way back in May. And it was, can you find, well, not lead, but can you find unsavory things in your figs? This was a gentleman who had a fig tree in a sewage field, like he didn't have city water, even though he could have. And this fig tree was big, it was beautiful. We're talking hundreds of figs every year, and he ate them and he was still alive, so I'm assuming it was safe. But the reason he had reached out to us is because his neighbors were wondering if he wanted to share. And like, obviously he wanted to, but he didn't want, since it was growing in a sewage field, for liability reasons, he just didn't want to start sharing them. So he asked us. And of course, I told him, you'll be fine. I mean, you're alive, so I'm assuming that the figs are safe. But I just said very generally, plants have enough mechanisms that it shouldn't matter, right? And I answered that, and it was months ago. But I thought about it again while doing this, and I was like, well, let me do a little bit of digging. Let's do some paperwork. Let's see what we can find. So I decided to take you guys on my little research journey with me. So we're going to talk about, can you find heavy metals in fruit? So what does the research say? These are papers pulled from the last 10 years, and I have them in a Word doc with notes if anyone wants to see them. Lead, iron, and tin were concentrated in the plant roots of multiple conventional crops and non-edible crops in farmland in Brazil. That is the result of one paper. Another paper, heavy metal concentrations in apple and nectarines irrigated with treated wastewater was found far below toxic levels. In other words, there were heavy metals in the fruit, but they were way below WHO standards of what is unsafe to consume. They also decided to treat the fruit with water with E. coli, and it turns out that the plants didn't take up the E. coli. So that's a fun fact that we learned. And this was done here in the United States. This study was done in either Iran or Pakistan. And it turns out that olive trees are heavy metal accumulators. The olive trees that they had irrigated for over 15 years with treated wastewater, which is typically done in the Mediterranean due to lack of water resources, they found that the edible part of the olive, the flesh of the olive, had levels lead, copper, and these levels of lead and copper were a lot higher than any of the other things I'm talking about today. So like if we said, if here's the bottom, if apple had this much lead, olive had this much lead. And that is consistent with several studies across the Mediterranean, places like Greece, Turkey, and so on and so forth. But that is olive specific. So let's bring it back to the United States and a little bit more to home. A urban community garden in San Diego decided to do another heavy metal test, and they had some fruit trees, but they found lead in the leaves, but not the fruit, of their blood oranges, limes, and figs. So all the lead that they had just stayed in different parts of the plant. But they also they had plants directly in the soil. So we're talking strawberry, tomato, lettuce, kind of rotational crops. And they found in that urban soil, they found that those crops had traces of lead, arsenic, cadmium, cobalt, and chromium. Again, totally safe, but it was there, which was interesting. Peppers, and I will get to the next one, but certain plants like peppers, broccoli, lettuce, and cauliflower seem to be terrible at accumulating heavy metals. These peppers were grown somewhere in the Southeast. They were grown in yard waste, sewage treatment, and chicken manure, and they did not uptake any lead, chromium, or nickel, which was mild and hot, so either one is good. And another study was done kind of the same way with, again, leafy crops, and none of them seem to take up heavy metals, so they seem to have this resistance. So the uptake of metals is species specific. So of course that makes the term "it depends" a whole lot more complicated. And the last two studies I'm going to point out to you, these are sources of pollution that did not come from your soil or water, but came from the air. So a study I forget the name of the city, but a study done in the city of the United Arab Emirates looked at date fruit and cedar fruit trees that were planted along city streets. And exhaust from cars releases pollutants. So they were looking at does the pollutants from your exhaust of your cars actually lead to heavy metals in your fruit? And the answer is yes. There's a positive correlation between levels of traffic and heavy metals found on the outside of the fruit, and in cases where there were really heavy traffic, actually inside the fruit. And another study out in the Middle East as well was done, but with pomegranate fruits from roadside farms. Again, roadside implying there's traffic along the way. And because of that air pollution from that traffic, cobalt, cadmium, lead, and chromium were found on the surface of those pomegranates. So that seems pretty straightforward, right? The answer seems like, yes, it can happen, but why? Because we're master gardeners and we'd like to know why, right? Spoiler alert, the answer is they don't know yet. But I'm going to talk to you guys about some of the potential theories. So this is the most in-depth, we're going all the way back to botany. This is the most in-depth I will ever take you guys in this presentation. But this is a root. This is what it looks like on the inside. We remember our xylem for water and nutrients. We remember our phloems for sugars, right? So any water or nutrient, so this includes ions, has to go in through the root. And it goes through all these little cells, right? And it moves through passive or active transport, which we reviewed in our first class. Don't worry, these are not specific proteins. This is just a general picture of how they get in. So we know diffusion is moving from a high concentration to a low concentration. So that's for like these guys, just pretend this is water. That's how that moves through. Another form of simple diffusion is channel proteins, because just like us, plants have a resting electrical charge, and they have those in their membranes. So if a charged ion or something wants to get in, it can't just move through our plasma membrane, it has to have help. So these are little like tunnels for those charged chemicals to go through. Carrier proteins also use passive transport, but it's literally whatever's trying to come in is so big it just can't. So the protein grabs it and then physically puts it inside. It looks way more weird if you look at an actual like 3D rendering of it. And then of course we have active transport, which is moving against the gradient. So you are using energy in the form of hydrogen ions to pump out whatever it is. So this is just a general picture. These are the exact ways that anything can go in and out. So we'll go back to this picture. Now we know on like the very edge, you see all these lines. That previous picture, that's what's happening. So there's two ways that water and nutrients can get in, and that is through the symplastic pathway and the apoplastic pathway. Those are just fancy words for inside and outside of the cell. As you can see up here, symplastic is actually moving through the cytoplasm. As you can see, there's little like tunnels, so to speak, that connect the insides of all the cells in the root. So that is the symplastic way they move through and eventually get to our xylem. And the apoplast, as you can see with this green arrow, is going around the outside, right? And eventually you end up in your xylem. Now, those three cells over there, if we zoom in, that's what it looks like. And these are all pictures I pulled from graduate school. So this is a better picture of showing that inside movement and that outside movement. So, okay, we know what's happening on our plasma membrane. We know how it's moving through. So what about metals? Aside from the fact that I love this Disney movie, this is kind of how, this is how plants treat heavy metal ions. So basically, you have to remember lead and things like that, they're elements, they're dense, they're heavy, and they have a charge. Because of the mechanisms I told you about, they just can't get in. They're too heavy and they're charged, and there's no way to change that charge. The only way a heavy metal can get inside the plant, and I apologize, I couldn't find a better name for this, is through a non-metallic, oh goodness, I forget the name, but basically it's a giant chemical that takes the metal ion, and the metal ion attaches itself and it loses its charge. And that is the only way a metal can get inside the plant. Now, you think, okay, well, there's your answer. Well, it's part of something else. So that wouldn't be able to be picked up in terms of a heavy metal presence. So at some point inside the plant, that ion, so let's say it's lead, that lead ion comes off. They have no idea how, which is unfortunate. But there are theories as to why that is. And that pathway I was showing you, since there's so many steps that everything needs to take to get inside, it's theorized that somewhere along that point, that metal can come off and just exist and go through the xylem and the phloem and end up wherever it wants to be. But let's see what I have next. Okay. But obviously not all hope is lost. The studies I mentioned to you were in urban areas or treated wastewater, et cetera. All of those things are extreme examples, right? The average homeowner lawn, hopefully, aside from our sewage field fit guy, should be pampered and tailored enough that it shouldn't really matter. You shouldn't, if you have heavy metals in your soil, that's a whole different thing, especially if you're not in a really urban area. But the soil can actually help. So chemistry, chemicals attach, detach, ions attach, deattach. That happens in our soil. So if you were to have, any type of heavy metal or something not good, because of the charge of your soil, because everything carries an electrical charge, they should be picking up and taking up those metal ions. So if something's getting into your plant, it's because there was so much in the soil that the soil can't handle it anymore. So that is the soil and waterway that it is theorized that our heavy metals get into our plants. And now there's the airway. They also don't know the answer to that, but the only thing they can think of right now is our stomata, which, as you remember, those little holes underneath your leaf, and that is where plants take in their carbon dioxide for photosynthesis and they release their oxygen. That is the only way they think that heavy metals can get in right now. Again, the science is not been discovered yet. They know that there's a genetic mechanism behind it, but it has not been discovered. So this is what they think. So, can you find heavy metals in your trees? Yes, you can. And we don't know how, but it is possible. But regardless of that, across all those studies I told you, these are way below the amount that the WHO considers to be toxic. I think it's about 300 milligrams of lead is needed to get lead poisoning. And most of the studies here, they were looking at micrograms and nanograms. So like, even though like someone might be, oh my God, there's lead in my face, it's fine. It's like this much compared to this much you actually need to get sick. But the question then becomes, well, what can you do about it, right? Because if you're in an urban space or if you're in a polluted area, there must be something you can do, right? There are. And actually, a lot of these methods are the same exact methods that we use for plant disease. So raised beds, you're using sterile media, you're not growing in polluted soil. Straightforward, right? Which is what that garden in San Diego should do. Now, grafting. They don't know this, they don't understand this either, but for some reason, in the same way that a rootstock can have higher disease tolerance, which we'll talk about later, for some reason, that grafted site right there, that rootstock plant, for some reason doesn't allow heavy metals to get into the scion, the part of the fruit you want. I don't know why, but it's a thing. So grafted fruit, which we will be talking about today. If you guys don't have grafted fruit trees, you're probably in trouble for other reasons, but that is another one. Microbes. So we have, this is a picture of mycorrhizal fungi. As you can see, they're little, I know this isn't the right term, but tendrils that go inside your root cap. We also have bacteria in the soil. These guys actually have detoxifying properties. And it has been shown, but again, they haven't found the gene, that microbe interactions with the roots of a plant seem to increase whatever detoxifying gene the plant has. So the presence of microbes can actually cheer on, I guess, the plant to not take up those heavy metals. So healthy soil, this is another reason why. And last but not least, and this is really for in those cases of air pollution, is to wash your fruit. From that date study, they found that washing the fruit removed just about everything. Unless you were in a case of really, really heavy pollution where it just really got in those date fruits, you should be able to wash off almost everything. So there you go. That is my little research rabbit hole.